Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is the 16GB Radeon RX 9060 XT. It's a modern mid-range card capable of solid 1440p gaming performance. Models start at around £329 here in the UK, and I now use this ASUS version as part of my personal gaming rig. If you're thinking about a card like this, then you might also be wondering what sort of CPU to pair with it. My recommendation would be a Ryzen 7600 or similar, so Ryzen 9600X, i5 14600K, that sort of 150 to 200 processor price point. But what about something even cheaper, like this, my good old i5 12400F, a 6-core 12-thread socket 1700 CPU that sits at the £100 or around $100 price point. Mine has spent most of its time in this basic H610 DDR4 motherboard with 32 gigs of 3200MHz RAM. Is something like this suitable for a card like a 16GB 9060 XT, or will it bottleneck? Now, bottlenecking is when one component holds the others back or stops it reaching its full potential. For example, if a CPU were to prevent a graphics card from being fully utilised or achieving the highest possible frame rates, could be because the CPU is too weak or too old, or both. If you have a performance overlay enabled like MSI Afterburner, then you may notice the GPU utilisation frequently sitting at less than 90%. Games may still feel fine to play, but a CPU bottleneck will likely impact the consistency or smoothness. This can be represented by the percentile lows, or 1% and 0.1% lows, that you may have seen in benchmarking videos, including mine. Today I'm going to be testing a handful of my favourite games with the i5 12400F, 32 gigs of 3200MHz DDR4 and the 16GB 9060 XT to see if this combo is suitable for 1440p gaming. For context, I'll also have comparative results on screen from a Core i9 14900K, a high-end processor that's guaranteed to allow our graphics card to fully stretch its legs, so that we can see how much performance we're missing out on, if any, by using the cheaper i5. At 1440p, these differences may be smaller, especially with a mid-range card like this, but I feel like it's what you'll likely be playing at if you buy a 16GB 9060 XT, so that's why I chose it. Results at 1080p will differ, and the CPU may be more of a limitation. Before testing, I wanted to mention that I actually used a different motherboard. I used a Z790 board, albeit a DDR4 one, which was quite difficult to find, but I wanted to make sure we were using the same board and the same DDR4 RAM to try and limit the amount of variables. But let's get into the games. Let's get started with Battlefield 2042 then. Now this has seen a bit of a resurgence lately, I think because of the upcoming release of Battlefield 6, so people want to just play Battlefield until that comes out. Plus it was on sale not long ago. I paid like £2 something for Battlefield 2042, and while it's not among my favourite Battlefield games, it is a good one to sit down with every so often and just lose a couple of hours to. Now with the i5 12400F we were seeing 128 FPS with a 1% low of 71 and 0.1% low of 46. The GPU utilisation was sitting at around 85 to 90%, and because of this I thought we'd have a little more headroom when it came to getting more out of the 9060 XT. But if we look at the 14900K results, then you'll see that the average frame rate was only like 2 FPS more, and in terms of consistency it didn't really make much difference. The same occasional dips and drops occurred with the i9 as they did with the i5, which I thought was pretty interesting, despite the GPU utilisation reading slightly higher. Now in Counter-Strike 2 we saw 203 frames per second at 1440p with a high preset and 4x MSAA selected. The 1% low was 99 and the 0.1% low was 82. With the i9 14900K and of course the same settings, we saw an increased average of about 20 frames per second, so 226 this time around. The 1% low was also increased from 99 to 104, and our 0.1% low went up from 82 to 89. Now are you going to feel these differences if you were playing without an on-screen overlay enabled? Well, I'm not sure. It may feel a little smoother in certain areas, but this isn't what I'd call a massively significant change to performance. Nothing that's going to make you think, oh yes, this is miles smoother. The i5 is still putting up a pretty decent job, and as I said at the start, this is because we're using 1440p, so the 9060 XT is probably going to find itself limited anyway at this resolution, but I wanted to test at this res because I think if you're buying a card like this is what most of you are going to choose. At 1080p, any CPU limitations may be a bit more noticeable, especially in certain titles. Now, one of those titles I want to mention is Cyberpunk 2077, because this is quite CPU intensive, and even at 1440p with the i5, we do notice a few dips and drops here and there. Now, overall, we saw 74 FPS with the 12400F and 9060 XT combo, a 1% low of 46 and a 0.1% low of 38. So, pretty decent. Most of the time, or a lot of the time I should say, you're going to notice at least 90% GPU utilization. But when we make our way into the more crowded parts of Night City, especially with the crowd density setting turned up to high, like I have here, then it may take its toll on our 6-core 12-thread CPU. The 1% low was 46 and the 0.1% low was 38. Now, if we look at the i9 results on screen too, you'll see that the average wasn't that different. Again, because the 9060 XT is most of the time the limitation, 78 frames per second however, so 4 FPS more. The 1% low was actually 10 FPS higher, 56 compared to 46, and our 0.1% low went from 38 to 47, so again almost a 10 FPS improvement here, and it just means that with the i9 you're going to get a more consistent gameplay experience thanks to the extra cores and threads and power that we see from this chip. Is it worth the extra money though? Well, that's entirely up to you. Like I said in one of the other tests with the i5 here, it's still a playable and enjoyable result. GTA 5 Enhanced next with the very high RT or ray tracing preset, and TAA gave us 91 FPS with the i5 12400F and 9060 XT combo, a 1% low of 74 and a 0.1% low of 71, so couldn't really ask for more here. Perfectly consistent, a really smooth gameplay experience. With the 14900K in the system, we hit 93 frames per second, a 1% low of 74 and a 0.1% low of 72. So not really any different in terms of the performance metrics. For Helldivers 2 with the Ultra preset, 66 frames per second with the i5 and 9060 XT with a 1% low of 60 and a 0.1% low of 57. This one is usually very consistent and it's no exception here. Ran really nicely with the i5 and 9060 XT combo without any issues to speak of. With the i9 14900K in the system, we did see an improvement of 3 FPS to the average, so 69 overall, nice. The 1% low was up from 60 to 65 and the 0.1% low was up from 57 to 63, so again a slight improvement with consistency, but again this may not be something that you're going to notice when actually playing without an FPS overlay enabled. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is generally more GPU intensive, but it can be more CPU intensive in busier towns or cities. Here I have noticed a few spikes in the CPU utilization, but overall with the i5 and 9060 XT we saw 78 FPS, 1% low of 69, nice, and a 0.1% low of 67, so again nothing to complain about in terms of consistency here. With the i9 we got 80 FPS, so 2 FPS more on average, a 1% low of 70, so 1 FPS more, and the 0.1% low was basically the same at 67 or 66.5 compared to 66.7, so margin of error stuff here. Again, it's a good result for the i5, doing pretty well considering its £100 or dollar price tag these days. For Oblivion Remastered, we saw 62 FPS with the medium preset at 1440p. This of course does have its fair share of problems. This is Unreal Engine 5, isn't it? So I've come to expect this. 49 FPS was that 1% low, and the 0.1% low was 27. I was thinking maybe the i9 could improve upon these figures, but to be honest it was basically the same. If we look at the on-screen figures, we're seeing 62 FPS again, 48, so 1 FPS lower with the 1% average here, and a 0.1% low that was about 1 or 2 FPS better, 3 FPS better, 27 compared to 30, so not much of a change here again. We'll finalise then with Red Dead Redemption 2. This saw 102 frames per second with the i5 12400F, which is of course the gameplay you see on screen. The 1% low was 70 and the 0.1% low was 63, so could be better. I noticed specifically in and around Valentine as well as Saint Denis that this is where we saw a spike in CPU utilisation from up to like 85%, and it's clear that with the i9 that we are getting a more consistent gameplay experience. The average was basically the same, 101, so down 1 FPS, but the 1% low was up from 70 to 79, and the 0.1% low was up from 63 to 72. So, as I said at the start, it's the consistency and smoothness where you're going to notice the most differences with a better processor in pairing with a card like the 9060 XT at 1440p. Of course, you aren't going to need an i9 though, that is probably a bit overkill. I think a Ryzen 9600X, something like that, a 14600K i5 is probably going to give you the same as what you'd get from the i9, because at that point we're just GPU limited anyway, and it seems to be the case even with the i5 in a lot of scenarios at this resolution. But there we are, this is a combination that a few of you were asking me to test, so I thought I'd do it, and hopefully this is helpful to any of you looking at purchasing your next PC upgrade. Thank you as always for watching, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one. Leave a like if you enjoyed it too, and subscribe to the channel if you want to and haven't done so already, of course.